For 3 years, Vladimir Putin told his people the war was not their problem. The economy was booming, walkies were up, factories were humming. Russia, he said, was thriving under pressure. And for a while, the numbers actually backed him up. But here is the part nobody was saying out loud. That growth was a lie built on borrowed time. And right now, in 2025, the bill has finally arrived. Not to the Kremlin, not to the generals, to ordinary Russian people in their grocery bills, their mortgage payments, and their pension checks. Stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you will understand how a government can spend its way into a war and accidentally trap its own citizens. Inside it, let's start with the money, because that is always where the real story is. Russia's GDP grew over 4% in both 2023 and 2024. Impressive numbers. The kind Putin loved to parade on state television. But those numbers were not built on innovation, or exports, or a stronger private sector. They were built on one thing only: war spending. The Kremlin was writing enormous checks, pumping cash directly into the defense industry, and calling the resulting economic activity growth. That is not growth. That is a sugar rush, and every sugar rush ends the same way. Russia's federal budget this year set aside roughly $160 billion for national defense. That is 37% of total government spending. Nearly 4 out of every 10 rubles the Kremlin collects goes straight to the war machine. Not to hospitals, not to schools, not to bridges or roads. To missiles, tanks, ammunition, and soldiers. Now, here is the economic reality that no amount of propaganda can erase. When you flood an economy with that kind of military spending, you create a massive surge in demand. Soldiers need to be paid. Factories need workers. Contractors need materials. Money starts moving fast. But the supply side of the economy, the actual goods and services available to regular people, cannot keep up with all that new cash floating around. The result is inflation. And Russia's inflation problem became serious. Fast. Prices hit 9.5% inflation in late 2024. The Russian central bank had no choice but to respond, and respond hard. They raised interest rates all the way to 21%. Think about what that actually means on the ground. If you are a Russian small business owner trying to borrow money to expand, you are paying 21% interest on that loan. If you bought a home on a variable rate mortgage, your monthly payment just became unaffordable overnight. And those subsidized mortgage programs the government had been running, the ones that helped millions of working class buy their first homes, gone. Scrapped entirely. The war economy handed people a paycheck with one hand, then it quietly picked their pocket with the other. And it gets worse from here. Russia's economy shrank at the start of 2025. Full-year growth is now projected at around 1%. 1%. Compare that to 4% the year before, and you start to understand the scale of the slowdown. Retail sales grew by just 2% this year. Food retail grew by 2.4%. What that tells you is that Russians are spending more of their income on basic necessities, like groceries, and less on everything else. Economists have a term for this. They call it a declining living standard. In plain language, it means people are getting poorer. Now, layer on top of that the oil problem, and things get really uncomfortable for Moscow. Russia's entire war budget depends on oil and gas revenue with always has. But oil revenues are down roughly 20% this year, driven by falling global prices. Every $10 drop in the price of a barrel of oil punches a direct hole in the Kremlin's budget. And right now, oil is trading near its lowest levels in years. Russia collected less budget revenue in 2025 than it originally planned. For the first time since the pandemic, the gap between what Putin is spending and what Russia is actually earning is getting wider every single month. So what does a government do when it is running short? The same thing every desperate government does throughout history. It reaches into the pockets of its own people. Russia hiked its value-added tax from 20% to 22% at the start of this year. More businesses are being dragged into the tax system. A new levy was introduced on consumer electronics, including laptops and smartphones. Every Russian consumer is now paying more for everyday goods, not because of market forces, but because the war needs to be funded and the money has to come from somewhere. At the same time, government transfers to the Pension and Social Insurance Fund were cut by more than $17 billion in 2025 alone. The people absorbing the sharpest pain here are not the oligarchs who profit from defense contracts. They are retirees living on fixed incomes. They are teachers. They are nurses working in understaffed hospitals. And here is the cruel irony built into the whole system. The defense industry workers, the ones welding tank parts and assembling missiles, did see their wages explode. Some categories of workers saw their pay triple or even quintuple between 2021 and 2024. But all that extra cash chasing the same limited supply of consumer goods just pushed prices higher for everyone around them. The workers who won in the war economy inadvertently made things worse for all the workers who lost. This is the guns versus butter problem, and Russia has been ignoring it for 3 straight years. The math behind this is worth breaking down clearly, because it reveals just how deep the trap goes. Before the war, Russia spent around 3 trillion rubles per year on defense. Reasonable. Manageable. In 2025, the planned defense budget was 13.5 trillion rubles. That is more than 4 times the pre-war level. Military and security spending combined now eat up roughly 40% of Russia's entire federal budget. Economists who monitor Russian finances have been remarkably direct about where this leads. If Putin tried to push military spending to 20 trillion rubles, the entire economic system would begin to unravel. The ceiling has been reached. And even the Kremlin seems to quietly understand this, because for the first time since the war began, the 2026 defense budget is actually lower than 2025. Not because the war is ending, but because Russia genuinely cannot afford to keep spending at this rate. But here is the trap that makes this situation so dangerous for Moscow. Cutting military spending now would trigger an economic collapse on its own. The defense sector has become the spine of the Russian economy. Dozens of cities, hundreds of factories, millions of jobs are all tied to war production. You cannot switch it off. Russia is caught between 2 walls, and both walls are moving closer. This is the scenario Western strategists have been watching for. Not a dramatic battlefield collapse, not a sudden coup or a revolution in the streets, just a slow, grinding economic suffocation. Every month, the war drags on. The arithmetic gets harder for Moscow. Every sanction that holds, every oil price drop, every interest rate hike tightens the vice. Another fraction. To be fair, Russia is not on the verge of collapse tomorrow. Analysts at major security think tanks are clear about that. As long as Russia keeps selling oil at a workable price, it has enough to keep going. Putin is not going to run out of money next Tuesday. But the cushion is gone. The emergency reserves are thinner. And the Kremlin is now asking ordinary Russians to carry a burden that was invisible to them for the first 3 years of this war. Higher taxes, higher prices, smaller pensions, fewer home loans. For the first time, the Russian public is being asked to look at their wallet and feel the war, which brings us to the real question. The one that nobody can answer with certainty yet. Is this slow economic squeeze ultimately more dangerous to Putin's hold on power than any military setback on the battlefield? After all, Russia has absorbed enormous battlefield losses, and the regime has not flinched. But economic pain is different. It is personal. It is daily. It is impossible to fully hide behind state media when your grocery bill tells you a different story every single week. Or does Putin's control over information run so deep that Russians will simply never connect the dots between a shrinking paycheck and a war they were told was nearly won 3 years ago? That is the argument I want you to make in the comments. Which force do you think is more likely to change the outcome of this war? Bullets or bankruptcy? Let's hear it.